Welcome to Belling History with the Good Time Girls, a hyper-local podcast about the quirky history of Bellingham, Washington, and the fourth corner of the United States. Even though we like to keep things close to home, these stories are no less entertaining to the masses and those who find themselves, unfortunately, outside of the PNW. We are your hosts. I'm Colby.
And I'm Ren, and we are co-owners of Belling History Tours, also known as the Good Time Girls. If you want to know more about our tour business, visit our website at bellinghistory.com. Today, we have another re-release episode from Badtown Season 2 of the City of Subdued Podcast, hosted by Annika Fleming and Dalla Gasparina, and co-hosted by us, as well as founding mother, Marissa McGrath. These were recorded during the pandemic, so if you've heard them before, feel free to skip ahead. But we've got some true crime stories from the dark side, and if you've already heard them, wait until spring when we return with some new.
Yeah, but this one today we have some updates.
Yes,
some new thoughts.
Major updates.
So you might not want to skip this one.
Don't skip ahead.
This story never gets old either.
Today's episode, Colby, what are we calling?
Oh, I think it's called Bad Butcher Town. It's our old friend, the butchered Bellingham butcher, Mr. Frederick Dames. So if you've been on our gore and lore tours in downtown Bellingham, you may have heard us talk about this story. Or on the cemetery tour, we visit his final resting place. So give it a listen and hear the updates at the end.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, this is a good one because we've been literally talking about this man for 10 plus years.
I know.
On our
I feel
tours.
invested.
So many people have been on this tour and heard these stories. So you're going to get like an exclusive Colby update here at the end. Count yourselves lucky. Tell your friends and neighbors.
All right. Let's dive in.
Okay.
So, Maria, what are we learning about this week?
This week, we are learning about the butcher that got butchered and everything that comes with that. And I will say, I think for the first time ever, I'm going to put an official content warning on this episode for grotesque descriptions of violence done to a human body. Just needed to put that out there.
Yeah, that's fair. That's coming right up on this week's episode of Badtown.
Hello, it's Maria, and welcome to Badtown, where we discuss the darkest and baddest parts of Bellingham and Whatcom County history. We are joined today by Colby and Ren from the Good Time Girls. So, what story are you telling me about today?
Today, we're going to tell you guys a little bit about what we call the story of the butchered butcher. And it's a story about a man who was found brutally murdered in downtown Bellingham. And all the circumstances around his murder may or may not be unsolved.
Can I jump in for 1 second?
Yeah.
It just occurred to me that maybe it would be good to mention that this story is like one of our oldest stories that we've been telling on our gore and lore tours, I think, since Sarah and Marissa first started the tours back in, I think they first did gore and lore in 2011. And it's just such a fabulous story. And also the story is covered in pretty good detail in a book called Murder in the Fourth Corner by Todd Warger, who is a museum employee here in Bellingham who writes some really fun true crime books. If you're really into what we're telling you, a lot of these stories and others can be found there. And this is also one of our favorites because it's attached to some of our favorite drinking establishments. Ren, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories to tell. It's fun to do it a podcast way because we can kind of elaborate a little bit. So if we want to dive in, I guess we can get going.
Do it.
All right. So on April 12th, 1905, Frederick Dames is found murdered in his butcher shop on State Street. And the murder occurred sometime between 10 p.m. on April 11th and 8:15 in the morning. And the shop that we're talking about here was called the Palace Meat Market at the time on Elk Street, which is actually now renamed State Street, in a little drinking establishment, which we now refer to as the Red Light Bar. Some of you all might be familiar with that drinking establishment. We always love to plug it. And they have some really wonderful historic photographs of the butcher shops.
It also included the former Green Frog / Firefly, which sadly closed recently, but both of those establishments were connected as one at different points in history. The Green Frog / Firefly building was an addition to the original butcher shop. Just a little history.
That's what we're here for.
So Frederick Dames, he's found murdered, but he's not found murdered in the actual shop. He's found in his sleeping shack, which was located behind the shop. And that would have been kind of in the alley back there. You know, I'm sure most of you have drank on the Green Frog patio up there. So you'd be looking down on old Dames's sleeping shack. And the Great Northern Railway tracks kind of ran down the alley behind that. So kind of a real romantic spot to live out your days. So Dames is found on the morning of April 12th. And he is actually sadly found by his 16-year-old delivery boy.
God.
Yeah, I cannot even imagine. So the scenes of the murder showed signs of a great struggle. Everything in the shack was smashed. Dames's skull was actually crushed by multiple blows and cleaved by a hatchet. Then the coroner's report also tells us that the murderer pinned Dames to the ground using a screwdriver, which he bludgeoned into the floor with the blunt end of an axe through Dames's eye socket.
Ugh, so gross.
Yeah, so somebody had it out for Dames.
Yeah, that's a real gnarly one. Jesus.
Yeah, it's so brutal. That's kind of part of this mystery of the story, that level of brutality.
Yeah, and it's not just your typical, Wild West shootout kind of thing. This is a pretty intense kind of murderer, axe murderer, literally. So we have this really wonderful write-up from the Seattle Sunday Times, and I tell all my tour goers, if you haven't had the opportunity to read like an early 1900s, late 1800s newspaper, you really should get your hands on one because everything is poetry in these things.
If only newspapers were written like this today, I'd read them way more.
I know, they're so romantic and flowery. And so it's like tax write-ups, it's like stories about puppies, but it's also like descriptions of grisly murders. So what we have for you today is a write-up from the Seattle Sunday Times, which was published years later. We'll get to that later, but this gives a really good description of the crime scene. And so we like to read it. It's why fix what isn't broken? Because this does the job. So here we go. Evidently, the murderer had pushed his way quietly through the door, stepped softly to the head of the bed, turned on the light which hung near, and struck the first blow while the aged man slept. But the aim was not accurate, and before his assailant knew it, the butcher was up and grappling with his foe. Again and again, the hand axe descended on the skull of the doomed man, sometimes merely slitting the scalp, and again cutting an ugly wound. The butcher was not a man to cry out, and this probably accounts for the failure of the policeman on the beat to hear a noise. Persons in the neighborhood did hear scuffling, but thought little of it. Finally, the terrible onslaught of the assailant was too much for the victim, and he sank to the floor. There on his knees, he kept up the battle until a terrible blow just back of the right ear set him down. It was then that the matches were lighted, and the murderer might see his work was well done. Listening for a moment, the sound of a passerby or of persons approaching who might have heard the commotion, the blood-stained man opened the door, passed out into the night, and was gone without leaving a single mark to aid the officers in their search. Dun dun dun.
Ugh.
I like how they account for the failure of the policeman to hear a noise. It's like, just, we were we're totally doing our job. But he was just really brave and he didn't yell, which is probably totally not true. This poor guy. Oy. Yeah. Oh, and then, yeah, I guess I forgot to mention that the top of his skull was fully chopped off as well in that struggle.
Yeah, you gotta mention that. That's important. Okay, wow. Do we know anything about the victim, the poor butcher?
Yeah, he was kind of a mystery man in terms of, the citizens of Bellingham and what they knew about him at the time. But his name was Frederick Dames, or Dames. I'm not really sure the correct pronunciation, but we call him Dames. He was born in Germany about 1843 and came to New York with his parents and siblings in the 1850s. They settled in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His father, also named Fred, was also a butcher. But Fred Jr. apparently had a bit of a wandering spirit, and he left home about 1861, and he joined the 16th Iowa Infantry during the Civil War, during which time he lost a middle finger on his left hand at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee, and also that his regiment saw several months as prisoners in Andersonville. So a little trauma probably there from that experience. After the war, he tried prospecting. He went west and, was doing the silver and gold mining in Nevada and California, kind of just moving around a lot before falling back on his old, family learned skill of being a butcher. He started running meat markets in different locations. He lived in Portland before coming to Bellingham. The scene of the crime showed that he clearly put up a fight. He was 5'9". He wasn't a small guy for the times. His fists were bruised and cut up from fighting off his assailants. And in terms of looking for a motive, he was really known to be regular. He was a good businessman. He deposited his daily receipts every day in the bank. He didn't keep a lot of money on him. There was no money found at the scene, though. So, maybe there was some small amount of pocket change that could have been pilfered. The place did appear to be ransacked. What were they looking for? ? There was not a sign of forced entry. So that led people to wonder, did he know his assailants? Did he let them in? Or did he just forget to lock his door? There were no witnesses, no neighbors heard anything, really few clues other than the bloody hatchet and screwdriver that was impaled through his head. Later, they did find a stained, bloody overcoat in the bay, I believe. There's different stories that say it was in the bay or in a shack near the bay. And yeah, but like we said earlier, the brutality of this crime really suggests something along the lines of revenge slaying or crazy bloodlust. So it didn't really seem like a standard robbery. So people wondered about Dames and why, he had started businesses and left places and kind of moved around a lot. He was a loner. He didn't have family. He did have family. He just hadn't talked to them in a lot of years, and he didn't have a wife or children. He was known to have a bit of a temper, and he was known to sometimes joke about quote unquote enemies who might be after him. But we don't have any real clue as to who these enemies were or why they might have been after him. So after, the crime was discovered, Dames had a burial at Bayview Cemetery. His grave is there. It is a military marker issued for his service in the Civil War. And eventually his sister, his only heir, and his aged mother were located in Wisconsin. So
we know all about the victim, but what I'm guessing our listeners are really interested in are the suspects. Who are the people that were on high alert for this crime?
Well, we had a number of suspects actually in the beginning, and that starts with these fools, and their last names are Davis and Donnelly, Charles Davis and William Donnelly. And right after the murders, Colby mentioned there was a bloody shirt found, and yeah, there is some dispute as to whether it was in the bay or in this shack, but it was near another sleeping shack, which was regularly inhabited by Davis and Donnelly. And they actually had robbed somebody else shortly after this whole Dames murder had happened. They robbed some guy for $20 and beat him up and left him in the streets. And so the police, in searching for any kind of evidence around that neighborhood, they found this bloody shirt around their place and brought them in for questioning. And since they had found out that they had committed this other crime and robbing and beating somebody else up, they brought them in thinking, like, surely these two fools have something to do with it. And they actually ended up getting them booked into Walla Walla, the state penitentiary, and trying to, and sentencing them for that somewhat petty crime of stealing the $20 and beating the man up, because they were hoping that they would keep them in there long enough to get more evidence in order to pin this Dames murder on them. But they never did. But these two, dumb criminals kind of ended up in Walla Walla for an extended sentence just for kind of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I mean, also being assholes, but that one went nowhere.
Yeah. So one of my favorite suspects in this case is it's a very interesting story. So you have this guy, Charles Weatherford, and apparently he was a suspect almost immediately after the crime, as some young boy on his bicycle had said, "Oh yeah, I ran into this guy on Elk Street / State Street that same morning of the crime, and he said, 'Don't go near the butcher shop.'" Unfortunately, the boy who came forward apparently immediately couldn't be located later, but 3 months after the murder, a woman came forward and said she had also talked to Weatherford on a streetcar, and he had told her many details of the murder, and that had occurred 2 hours before the body was actually found. So Weatherford is an interesting character, and at the time of the murder, he lived in a shack on the waterfront, and his neighbors were Davis and Donnelly, who also lived in another shack on the waterfront where all the lowlives apparently squatted. So Weatherford, like I said, he had been brought in and questioned immediately after the murder, but that there was nothing on him, so they let him go. But he was arrested again in January of 1908, so this is almost 3 years later, and he had been talking about it again to someone in Sumas. But as soon as they arrested him, he clammed up and refused to talk. They eventually brought him to the shack, to the scene of the crime, and he became animated and told the whole story, but he insisted he wasn't there and he didn't do it. And the essential truth of this is that Charles Weatherford had some kind of mental illness. Clearly, he was not right in his mind, and they were not sure what that meant. So the Seattle Daily Times published this really crazy article about it with this insane illustration. I will post it on our blog with a drawing of Weatherford, and the headline was, "Does this fiendish grin bespeak the murderer? In his cell lies man who tells story of gruesome crime, and he smiles, smiles, smiles." It's very sensational. And they describe him as ambling about like a drunken man through the long corridors of the county jail, at times sullen and morose, and refusing to heed his keepers or fellow prisoners, again walking about, peering through the bars of the cell with a fiendish grin upon his haggard features, indicating the conditions of the man's mind. So it goes on and on about Charles Weatherford, who's also known to the police. This whole time they refer to him as Happy Hooligan. And he has, by his own confession, said he did this crime at one point, but then he recants his story and says, no, he didn't at other points. So the police were just basically having a hard time because he was clearly mentally ill. They couldn't figure out whether that made him more likely to have done it, with their thinking being only some deranged person would commit such a crime, or was he just delusional and kind of parroting something he had seen or heard? Since they had kind of ruled out that Dames had any sort of deadly enemy or that he was killed for his money, they were kind of starting to lean towards this. Maybe it was just some psycho. So hence they arrest Charles Weatherford and are kind of looking at him pretty intensely. There was also a story about Dames having kicked a hobo, quote unquote, out of his butcher shop prior to the murder. But that was actually later described by a lady who ran a restaurant where Dames ate lunch as being what sounds like Davis and Donnelly, as he told her about it while he was eating lunch. So, Ren, do you want to talk about the spirit lady?
Yeah, I like this story, and I don't often tell it on my tours.
Right?
It's really offbeat. But basically what happens is on February 15th of 1908, which is 3 years after the murder occurs. So yeah, there was another sort of offbeat suspect, a spirit who claimed to know all about the Dames murder. So a sheriff received many mysterious letters from a woman who knew about the Dames murder, but who says that she is a spook and can't be communicated with. In one of her letters, she says that she is controlled by supernatural powers and the sheriff cannot see her. So it says, I don't know, where's the quotes from, Colby? Is it
It's
from
the Bellingham
paper?
Herald.
It's free, yeah. So for the Bellingham Herald, we have some like quotes that describe the situation. They say, the officer is willing to take his chances with spirits and would like to arrange a meeting. Sheriff Williams is now trying to locate a mysterious woman who has signed her name as Spirits to a letter in which she claims she knows all about the murder of Frederick L. Dames. The woman has written half a dozen letters in the past few months. The woman sets forth many interesting details in her letters as to how the murder was committed and implicates certain persons. Ordinarily, no attention would be paid to such missives, but the woman tells such a circumstantial story and seems to know so much about it that the sheriff is inclined to follow the French theory in all crimes, cherchez la femme, which is a sexist French cliche of detective pulp fiction, which basically says, no matter what the problem, a woman is often the root cause. So we're chasing spirits now because we're hoping that a woman did this.
Or is the cause. Like maybe he was fighting with someone over a woman. I don't even know. They're just grasping at straws here, clearly.
Goes to, paint the picture of how desperate we all are to find this crazy person.
They actually took out a personal ad, like a want ad, like being like, hey, woman who's written letters claiming to be spirits.
Oh my gosh, come forward.
We actually want to talk to you because you actually said some things that make us think you might know more than...
Maybe they got out the Ouija board.
I know, what? So many weird things in this story.
I mean, psychic crime fighters are always like my favorite
Right?
genre of fiction, so I can totally get why they would want to buy into it.
Well, and apparently sometimes it's legit, I think. I mean, I don't know.
Hey, I will be the first one to say I think ghosts are real. So
They don't show themselves
No
to
shame.
me, so I'm jealous, but it's not saying I don't believe. I just have never seen one.
Yeah, no spirits have ever written me any letters, but
Sadly.
I believe. I know. There was another interesting one that I don't typically talk about on my tours, and that was a suspect in May 7th of 1908. And apparently there was a dope fiend arrested in Portland for the murder of Nathan Wolfe, a pawnbroker. And there was some similarity between those crimes. Wolfe, the pawnbroker, was struck down with an axe and then dragged into a rear room and had his head chopped off with the weapon. Does that sound familiar?
Pretty brutal.
So yeah, another suspect in the case.
Yeah, that one's weird because it never gets mentioned again. So I'm assuming, he had an alibi or something.
Still, there's some kind of axe murder fad.
They do a lot of waxing philosophical about the nature of this crime and whether, that means that it was someone totally out of their mind, or whether someone would do this just to, get a few bucks. Or there's so much in the newspapers about what would drive someone to do this. And that's pretty interesting. But let's meanwhile go back to Charles Weatherford, our mentally ill guy, who by September of the same year, he's still in jail. They had arrested him, and were trying to figure out if they had anything on him. And by September, they basically decided he was a simpleton, quote unquote, and that he had nothing to do with the killing of Dames, and that his story was merely, quote, the delusion of a weak mind. But Weatherford, by this time, he was like, jail is now my home. This is a comfy place to be. This poor guy had been homeless in a shack with these, horrible criminals and whatnot on the waterfront. And now he has 3 hots and a cot, and he's pretty excited about that. And he would do anything they wanted him to do if they didn't make him leave the jail. He mowed the lawn, he split the wood. And there's a quote saying, "There may be a law forcing you to put a man in jail, but I never heard of a law forcing you to make him leave." Because he put up such a fight, he did not want to leave. They were like, maybe you could go to the county poor farm, yada, yada. So a fellow prisoner wrote this whole poem about Happy Hooligan. It's kind of long. Do you guys want me to read this whole thing?
Yeah, I'm interested in the Happy Hooligan.
Okay, so this poem was written by a fellow prisoner in the county jail, J.A. Sells, and here we go. They bid me leave my happy home. They bid me hit the trail to wander from the comforts of the dear old county jail, from the strong steel tank that shelters me from the winds that blow. They bid me hike, but you bet your life I ain't going to go. I said I was a murderer when I first came to stay, yet after this they heartlessly now bid me go away. I'll say I killed another man, 2 men, 10 men, a score, and if that does not satisfy, I'll say a dozen more. The woman's ward is occupied, but I can sleep within. To ask me now to seek for work would be a deadly sin. The thought of going fills my eyes with bitter blinding tears. Oh, leave me yet a little while, say 10 or 20 years. Oh, ask me, woo me not to leave my dear old county jail. Who then would sweep the corridor or dump the garbage pail? I get my grub, I get my rags, tobacco too I get. Thou sweetest snap I ever struck, I cannot leave you yet. I love the dear old county jail, so safe and snug within. I even love the dear old spoon, with which my spuds I skin. I love the soup, I love the mush, the stew and all the rest, and not one wave of trouble rolls o'er my peaceful breast. I love the sheriff, Frank I love, and Stanley I love too. I even love my work because I have not much to do. I love to sing my sad, sweet song, as o'er life's sea I sail. Be it ever so humble, there's no place like county jail.
I actually sort of love that.
I want it to be a country song. I could just hear it to like the tune of like a, Hank Williams type song or something. So Frank is the jailer and Stanley is the cook, they explained.
I see. So even with all of these characters and all of these leads, nothing really panned out for a real suspect they could pursue. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, nothing panned out and the case went dormant. But years later, a string of murders in Maple Falls kind of reawakens this case of the butchered butcher. But we're going to need a whole lot more time to get into that one.
Oh, really? Well, I think that means that this is going to be a 2-parter, and we are so excited to hear about it.
Okay. Updates.
All right.
Let's get into it.
I mean, get it, girl. I'm so excited, Colby. Like, this is...
Okay. Well, first of all, we should mention, because we did talk about the crime occurred at the Red Light Bar, which has since moved from the State Street location over to Grand Avenue. And I believe they still renting or leasing the building on State Street, but we haven't heard what the plans are for it or what's happening. I haven't seen anything about that in a while. And then I don't know what's going on with the green frog / firefly / whatever it was just recently that didn't last either. That space is also, I believe, empty. So the current scene of the crime is currently
inaccessible.
Yeah, vacant or empty or not publicly accessible. So there's that. So updates. Yeah, one of our guides, our Good Time guide, Sarah, had recently found an article in the San Francisco Examiner, which has been digitized online through a subscription. And I hadn't seen this one before. It was pretty exciting because it had a lot of photos and graphic depictions. Look. And it has a photo of Dames I had never seen before. He's wearing a top hat and looks very dapper. It also has a photo of his half-sister, Mrs. Wellhausen. So that definitely, I don't know if we actually said that in the episode, but it was his half-sister was his only living relative, and she was caring for her aged mother, which was Dames's stepmother.
Yeah, not related.
Yeah, and they had not heard from him since 1886, when he had paid for funeral expenses for his father and his brother. So those were the last times that they had heard from him. So I think, his father dies, his full blood brother died, and he kind of just disappeared after that. But weirdly, the article, you saw it, has a drawing of a house. that is captioned, "The Tumbledown Cabin in which Mr. Dames's body was found." But the drawing looks like a house on a country lane. You know, it's a kind of creepy looking, but it looks like a little cottage.
A house.
Yeah.
It's a whole house.
Like it has a gable roof, a chimney.
out in a field.
Yeah.
We're talking about a tumble-down shack by the fucking train tracks.
In an alley. Yeah, which definitely didn't have a gable roof or anything like that.
It was one room,
Yeah.
girl. Like,
no, it wasn't quite one room because half of it, we're gonna get to that.
Yes.
But it definitely wasn't this drawing. It feels like they just like asked the artist for the newspaper to like pull out like a stock drawing of like
it's clip art.
Yeah, exactly. Total clip art. Anyway, they get some other details wrong in the article, so a grain of salt. But so this kind of inspired me, and I went back and reread a bunch of the newspaper articles in my files, of which there are many, many, as it was a major news story. So I always find that with old historical newspapers, you try to get like the localist possible paper because it's going to have the most details, whereas the further and further away you get, they kind of condense it into a little sensational,
It's like
paragraph.
Telephone.
And they start to get details wrong and they leave things out. So you always want to try to find the most local accounts. They're going to give a lot more details and things like that. But it's always good to kind of scope out a wide range and see what's being said out there. So you can get lost in it. I can get lost in it. So I was reading back through the Herald and I was like, it mentioned that people had attempted to set fire to the building, which I was like, what? But then I remember there was the matches in that one account.
Okay.
And then I reread, and a lot of them do mention that there were burned matches scattered over the floor of the cabin. But it was probably because, like in that one article that we often read, they had knocked out the light bulb of the lamp or whatever was in the cabin in the fight.
Yeah.
And so then they were lighting matches to try to look for something.
Yeah. No, it did seem like that. The matches were lit. They mentioned that specifically in that article, yeah.
But that is interesting because they definitely seem like they were looking for something after the fact by lighting matches.
Interesting.
And then I was also struck by the description of the shack that mentioned, quote, "The little shack in which the old man lived was divided into two parts. One section was used for his pigeons and the other for his sleeping apartment." So, and then later they also mentioned bunnies. So apparently half the shack of this structure Dames lived in this alley was where he kept pigeons and bunny rabbits. Presumably raising them for meat?
By the train tracks outside the butcher shop. Yeah. Yeah, so I did a little digging.
Thank you, Ren.
Kind of my little job here. I do the weird, inane history. So I found out, though, that pigeons, it's not so uncommon at this time in U.S. history that people were totally eating pigeons. In fact, so pigeons were once plentiful in the U.S. That, means, the late 1800s.
Yeah.
By 1917, we weren't seeing so many of these, wild pigeons.
Right.
But prior to that, they called them a kit. So, a big grouping of pigeons was called a kit. And in the U.S., a kit of them migrating could block out the sun. There were such big groups of them migrating. So these aren't the guys that you find, pooping on statues in the middle of cities. These are kind of a different breed. They're related to doves.
Doves, yeah.
Like that. So pigeons' babies are called squab, and they're often compared to veal because they're because once pigeons get older, they begin to fly.
I
no
have
longer
seen
tender.
Squab on menus.
Right now, it's all coming together. Right, there's probably a lot of restaurants that serve squab in town for 25 cents or whatever the hell. Yeah, so that's what that is. That's a baby pigeon.
Oh, God.
And they were really tender and juicy. And so prior to World War I, pigeon farming was commonplace. You can find pictures of kind of like we see chicken ranches today. Pigeon ranches.
Okay.
But you're only eating their babies, right?
Sad.
It's not great. So eventually the expense and the complications of raising the squab gave way to chicken farming.
Okay.
Post
just
wars.
More economic.
Like way more economic. But at the time that we're talking, so then the wild pigeons are hunted.
Yeah, this is wild because actually I went down a weird rabbit hole because, a pigeonhole. definitely a pigeonhole, because someone posted on Reddit, like, what happened, why are there not so many pigeons in Bellingham?
Oh, yeah.
And then there was like a lively discussion, like, there still are pigeons, but I definitely have noticed in my lifetime, I mean, downtown Bellingham did used to have more pigeons. There was just, it was the typical, what you picture of a city having pigeons. They're like the flying rats. Mm-hmm. And they're eating the cigarette butts and things like that. And, but then I read that pigeons weren't really considered like that, like flying rats of cities, until like the 1960s or 70s.
Yeah.
So fairly recently. But I suspect that something changed in like the urban ecology of Bellingham, because I do remember when Georgia Pacific closed down and the waterfront was just this big empty old industrial site, all these terns moved in, and there were like seagull and tern, like weird wars, because there was masses of them, thousands and thousands, like, staking out this new territory.
Oh, shit.
And so now I feel like there's a lot more seagulls and terns around.
Just booted the pigeons out.
Yeah, and so there's weirdly, right behind here where I live, my neighbors feed pigeons. They hang out on a wire right over there.
Yep.
So they are around. They're just not like... They're not the dominant on the scene.
No, they're not. Which is interesting because, then they did become city dominant, and now they're not even that anymore. Yeah, these bigger birds are taking their place. But when I did look this, I started by just being like, eating pigeons?
Question mark.
America? Question mark. And there was a whole fun little, like, urban survival website about how to catch pigeons in the city. And are they okay to eat? And things like that.
That makes sense. They always used to tell us that we were going to get the hantavirus from the pigeon shit in the abandoned buildings.
From what I've read, there's no real cases of people getting diseases from eating pigeons. But, I mean, too much pigeon poop, too much any poop is going to F you up.
Also, you know what never existed here when I was a child? Squirrels.
No way.
There were no squirrels in Bellingham that I remember. And I remember going, as a child, like, going to, like, a park in Seattle or somewhere and being like, wow! Squirrels! Like, being so excited.
Oh, hilarious.
Yeah, so they're all kind of invasive, I think, and now they're just freaking everywhere. Including downtown, I see them, and I'm like...
Oh, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
When I first moved here from Seattle, it was the black squirrels.
Those are invasive.
They're invasive.
Yes.
And I was like, what the hell is up with Bellingham and these black squirrels? I don't like it.
But I think the other ones are first. I think they're all invasive.
Oh.
But yeah, it's like wars of the urban animal. I don't know what's going on.
So back to Dames.
Okay.
He's raising these pigeons because they're really good, succulent, yummy meat.
That makes sense. I mean, I figured.
Normal
yeah,
thing.
because he's a butcher. I was like, it must be for the meat. Why else? He wouldn't just be like, I'm sending carrier pigeons. Messages.
Maybe that too, hopefully.
He's a spy.
But no. There were definitely people buying these. He was doing that for some money.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was interesting because they mentioned the door to the shack was open when the boy found him, but that the gate to the whole yard, so there was sort of like a fence along the alley.
That's interesting that there was a gate.
And that was fastened.
Yeah.
And they believed that the murderer climbed the fence into a neighboring porch where they found sand that, like, I guess he had like a path that was lined with sand. And so someone had like tracked it and they found sandy footprints with pigeon feathers and like bunny fur poop or something, where they were like, yeah, this is the way they like made their escape, which I thought was kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. So we had pigeons.
Yeah, we hadn't had that detail before about the fence or anything.
There was the whole enemies, storyline that people had testified Dames had mentioned, that he had these mysterious enemies, but apparently he didn't elaborate on that to anyone, which I'm like, why do you go around telling people that you aren't very close with, like, I've got enemies, but I can't tell you anything more. I'm just like, how does this come up in conversation?
Yeah.
I don't know. But I love the San Francisco article offers a supposed direct quote from Mr. Dames. Mm-hmm. They say, quote, I have an enemy. He has been like my shadow for years. Some morning they will find me dead, murdered. So I would take that with a very large grain of salt.
No, he did not speak those words to anyone.
But it did make for a great lead into the article there. It was made me want to read more. And then the Herald also mentioned that there was a train worker who observed a man coming out of Dames's yard a few days before the crime, and he said that same man he recognized later with another man who came and asked about like where the train's going, and he described him as being large and raw-boned.
What does raw-boned mean?
I think just like tough looking.
Burly.
Yeah,
Okay.
kind of a little rough around the edges, I think, but like...
I like it. I want to use it more.
Yeah.
I kind of can't feel out what it means.
And the police kind of dismissed the escape by train theory, though, because they thought because of the brutality of the murder, the people would have been real bloody.
Yeah.
And, like, trains were pretty
like,
a hotbed of
pigeon
activity.
feathers.
Yeah, like, they would have
somebody would have noticed.
been noticed. So they thought they maybe could have escaped by boat. That was a possibility, but there was definitely this theory of two men. There was the washerwoman living on an alley who had heard two men running, which brings us back to Davis and Donnelly, the men arrested in an old shack near the coal bunkers. And they were arrested for assault and robbery on that other man, but apparently that man who turned them in for the robbery was like, yeah, they totally killed Dames, don't really know the details on that. But they found in these guys' shack the overcoat with spots, which they believed to be human blood. And then you had witnesses who said this belonged to Dames, including the boy who found him and his friend from a nearby business. And they said both garments contained pigeon feathers and rabbit hairs. Which, again, leading back to the bunnies and pigeons on Dames' coat.
Telltale.
Which I thought was interesting. And then Davis and Donnelly then told conflicting stories about where they got the coat.
Yeah, this is a whole thing.
Yeah, so they're questioned separately and they're saying different things. And then you had a witness identifying Donnelly as a man who Dames had thrown out of the butcher shop, which a bunch of stories mentioned that like some tramp had been ejected or whatever. So there was quite a lot of circumstantial evidence, and police had thought that was Charles Weatherford that was the tramp. Our crazy Charlie, who, Smiling Charlie, the happy hooligan.
Yep. So then he kind of gets implicated.
Yeah, and so he, according to Todd's book, he's actually was living temporarily in the shack with those two, which would explain where he knew so much about it if they did it. Anyway, under questioning, both Donnelly and Davis and Donnelly, too many D's here, admitted they knew Dames, Davis, and Donnelly. So they had stated they had been in his shop the day before, so there is some proximity there. And then, I had never read this before. Acting on a tip, police declined to discuss any further where they got this tip from, but they had a tip that they should go look in a old abandoned coal tunnel near the cabin where these men were staying, where they did find bloody clothing.
It's crazy.
And they said the sheriff was compelled to crawl underground for a distance of 8 or 10 feet in the darkness in order to secure the bloody garments. Which I'm just like, that paints a great mental picture.
It does.
So they said it was an undershirt, an overshirt, a jumper, and a towel, all containing stains and blotches of human blood. And the towel was believed to have been taken from Dames' cabin, ID'd by the marker of the laundry service that he used.
Oh, wow. Okay, more than just bunny fur.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, a lot of people probably use the same laundry service, but... And yeah, that was like an old abandoned coal chute from the old coal mine, the Elsie Home coal mine.
But they were acting as a tip, and we don't know where that tip came from.
Nope. And then there was another mention of another tip. And this one I love because this took them to Everett, but it was the result of a conversation accidentally overheard in a Bellingham resort. Do you know what that means, Ren? It's a brothel.
Like a brothel.
That is a brothel.
Okay.
There's definitely a brothel.
Okay.
So that there was a woman in Everett with knowledge of the case that could supposedly give evidence to the relations between Davis Donnelly and Dames.
Okay.
So they went looking for this woman, presumably.
Went to the brothels of Everett.
Yes. They did not find anything as far as I could find.
She was like, hell no.
Yeah. But so they were chasing down some lead there, which was, again, they were really hot on those two guys, Davis and Donnelly. And they just didn't have anything solid to pin on them other than that larceny charge. So they went to Walla Walla for that. And that was they kind of gave up on trying to accuse them of the murder.
It's so bizarre that wouldn't have been enough evidence, but...
I know. I don't understand that either. All this bloody clothes, witnesses.
Many witnesses that have heard things. And it's pretty wild. And now we'll never know, honestly.
Yeah.
The way that works.
I don't know.
Crazy.
So, poor Dames. I did revisit his obituary, which I thought was interesting because they did mention, and I talk about this on our cemetery tour, but the Butchers Association was to attend the funeral in a body. They had the funeral in Mock and Sons, which was also right on State Street there in the Pepper Sisters establishment. And I loved that they said a mixed quartet would furnish music.
Oh, we're gonna have music? This is a whole to-do.
I know. And all veterans of the Civil War were invited to attend.
Yeah, I love that detail. I had never heard that. And
so anyway, I think we'll stop there because our next episode does kind of continue the saga with who they did eventually decide committed the murder. I have some more thoughts on that.
A whole story of his own, so yeah, I know.
So tune in for the next one, which also will have updates.
Some more updates. Yes, exactly. All right, you want to wrap it up then?
Yes, let's wrap up the episode.
Well, hey there, mama, where'd you go? You gotta reap just what you sow. That's too bad, too bad. To that old time, the old man hates without bad weather. Put on the side, they were sewn together. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
We'd like to thank you all for listening to Bellingham History with the Good Time Girls. And as always, do subscribe, review our podcast on your favorite podcast platforms, like us on all social medias, check out our tours and events, read our show notes and blog, all of that at bellinghistory.com.
Oh, Lou loves you red, Lou loves you blue. Most of the time, Lou just loves you blue. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music. I lost my hat, I lost my brim, I look like a crow's nest swinging on a limb. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
As usual, we'd like to thank Devin Champlin and the late, great Lucas Hicks for the use of the Gallus Brothers song, Too Bad West Coast Blues. You can find the Gallus Brothers and Devin Champlin on Bandcamp. And you can find our lovely Devin Champlin at Champlin Guitars in Bellingham.
Lost my hat, lost my brim, looking like a crow's nest swinging from a limb. That's too bad, too bad. Well, I got no bugging, I got no smokes. I look like Grandpap and all of his folks. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
Be sure to tune in next time for a very juicy episode of Belling History with the Good Time Girls.
And bad tap.
And more bad.
Thank you. Thanks.